Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Please, let's wait for a couple of minutes. Meanwhile, other people is joining also us. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome our today's webinar, Doing Business in Spain, hosted by Baker Tilly España. We are delighted to have all of you with us. And the purpose of this session is to give you a practical overview or introduction to key tax aspects for foreign investors and companies doing business in Spain. My name is Maria Mariñas, a partner in the International Tax Department of Baker Tilly Spain, and I will start the explanations about the corporate income tax, one of the main taxes applicable to Spanish entities. After my explanation, my colleagues Manuel Peñín and Elena González will follow with very interesting information about VAT and personal income tax. Please remember that during the whole webinar, the microphones will remain mute, but please feel free to send us your questions through the Q&A sections. So we will try to address all of them by the end of the session. So let's start. And I will start with a brief summary of the main tax rates applicable for the Spanish corporate income tax, because some important news has been approved during 2025. The general tax rate is still 25%, which is applicable to most of the Spanish tax entities. Before explaining some reduced tax rate, please notice that every time that I'm speaking about turnover thresholds, this must be considered in a group basis. So if your Spanish entity is belonging to a national or international company group, the turnover of the local entity must be added to that of all the other companies within the international or national group. Okay? So if you are creating or establishing a new entity in Spain, maybe you can benefit for the new tax rate for startups or newly incorporated entities, which is 15%, but not for the whole life on the entity, but only during the first two tax periods when the company has a positive taxable base. It's very important to understand what a startup or newly created entity is for tax offices, because it's not for any new entity. It is important that this Spanish entity is not belonging to an international group. In such a case, this reduced rate is not applicable. But additionally, it was also necessary that there is a new activity. And Spanish tax offices consider that there is no a new activity. For instance, when the shareholders were already rendering the same services as freelancers before incorporating the entity. Or for instance, with the business unit has been acquired to another entity. Additionally, there must be a real business activity, so this reduced rate of 15% is not applicable for pure holding entities. In case that your new Spanish entity is not able to apply this reduced rate, don't worry, we still have some good news, because from 2025 we have some other reduced rate that maybe you can apply. For instance, for very small entity, micro enterprises with turnover under 1 million years during the previous year, we can apply, there is two different income brackets, okay? The profits will be taxed depending on the amount. For instance, the first 50,000 euros of taxable profit will be taxed from 21% for 2025 until 19%, 17% applicable in 2027. If the profit is higher than 25,000 euros, there is another bracket that is starting in 22% for fiscal year 2025 and decreasing until reach 20% in the year 2027. And still, we have another option for your new company in Spain that is applicable for all those entities considered as small or medium enterprises, that is, with turnover between 1 million and 10 million euros in the previous year. In such a case, the general tax rate of 25% has been decreased until 24% for the year 2025, but is still decreasing 1 point every year until reaching the 20% rate in the year 2029. So this is very good news, and this is a very important improvement for the taxation of the Spanish entities. Of course, I understand that most of you know how to calculate the taxable base. It's basically the profit, the accounting profit, but always reduce or increase by the tax adjustment. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time in this webinar to explain the main rules on tax adjustments, but it's very interesting to discuss about the rules to apply the losses carry forward. Currently, in Spain, there is no time limitation for compensation of losses carry forward. That means that your Spanish company can offset previous losses with no limitation for an indefinite period. However, there is always a bad news. There is some yearly limits about the quantity of losses that we can apply. And this will depend on the turnover of the company during the previous 12 months, okay? So if the turnover was under 20 millions in the previous year, only 70% of the taxable base can be offset with the losses carry forward. If the turnover is between 20 and 60 million, the percentage is decreased until 50%. Only 50% of the taxable base can be offset. And finally, for those entities with turnover over 60 million euros, only 25% of the taxable income or taxable base can be offset. Of course, the rest of losses can be maintained and carried forward to the next year. This kind of limitation, the last limitation I'm explaining, is not applicable for those startups or newly incorporated entities that, as you remember, we were explaining that can benefit from a 15% corporate income tax rate. And this limitation is not for the whole life, again, but it's not, they can offset freely losses carried forward during the 3 first years, they show a positive taxable base. So now that we understand a little bit how the taxable base is calculated and the percentage or tax rate that we need to apply on it, when should we submit the corporate income tax form? Well, for those entities following the calendar year, so they are closing the financial year on 31st December, the deadline to submit the Spanish corporate income tax is the 25th of July. However, it's not compulsory for Spanish entities to follow the calendar year. You can close the financial year at any other moment. In such a cases, the deadline to submit the Spanish corporate income tax is the 25th day of the 7th month following the closing of the financial year. So let's say, in case that we close the financial year in 31st January, the deadline for submitting the corporate income tax will be 25th August, okay? 1 month later than for ordinary companies. And once we have submitted the final corporate income tax return, that's not all. The Spanish entities needs to prepare and submit 3 down payments or payment in advance during every year, okay? Those need to be submitted from 1st to 20th of April, October, and December of each year, regardless of when the financial year is closed. There are 2 different ways to calculate this down payment paid to tax offices. The quota method, which is the general one, and this is applicable by taxpayers or companies with income not exceeding 6 million euros during the 12 previous months, okay? And the calculation way is very straightforward. It's just applying 18% of the total tax liability already shown in the last corporate income tax return. But there is an additional or different method of calculation of down payments, which is the taxable base method. This is compulsory. This method is compulsory or mandatory for those companies with turnover over 6 million euros during the 12 months previous to the beginning of the fiscal year, financial year. However, this can be also applied in an optional basis by other entities, but this should be requested by every February, okay? And when is it interesting to opt for this alternative method? Well, it's very interesting for those companies that are expecting losses during the current year, but they did a big profit during the previous year. Because if those entities are following the general method, the quota method, they will need to pay 3 down payments during the year, even if they are facing some troubles or some losses. And they could only recover those 3 down payments when the final corporate income tax return is submitted. Now remember, this is on the next year. So to avoid this situation, if you are expecting some losses during the year, you can opt for the taxable base method. But remember to do this election and the correct registration during February. Otherwise, you cannot change the method. And what is the way to calculate the down payment under this alternative taxable base method, sorry. In such a case, we do not focus or we do not mind about the last tax return submitted. What we do is to take into account the accounting result of the 3, 9, and 11 months of the current financial year. So we need to close and to have already available the result of the current year at those 3 moments, okay? And over those accounting profits, we need to apply the same tax deduction rules, in general, the same tax rules for calculating the final tax return. Okay, and then of course, over this taxable base, we need to apply different tax rates depending, again, in the turnover of the company. If the turnover is less than 10 million euros, the general rate is 17%. Okay, this is 5/7 of the corporate income tax rate that the entity is applying in Spain. For those entities with a higher turnover, over 10 million euros, the general rate to pay the down payment, calculate the down payment, is 24%. But please take care. After this calculation, there is still a minimum payment of 23% on the accounting result. But luckily, this is only applicable for those entities with turnover with over 10 million euros. So for other entities, there is no minimum payment, and we just need to follow the taxable base and the rate applicable depending on the turnover. So now that we have a light overview of the general rules on corporate income tax, I want to briefly speak about some interesting tax deductions that are available in Spain. The one I want to comment is the R&D activities. And in Spain, there are two different kinds of activities that can benefit from this. One is the research and development expenses, and the other one are the technological innovations. The first kind of project, research and development, R&D, can benefit from a 25% deduction over all the expenses incurred in this kind of project. But there are also additional deductions for staff assigned exclusively to this project, or even an 8% deduction for investment in intangible and tangible assets, excluding buildings and land. For the other kind of projects, technological innovation, the general deduction is 12% of the expenses allocated to this kind of projects. And this is not the only benefit for this kind of projects. We also have a freedom from depreciation, excluding again buildings, and an important point. There is also the possibility to monetize or cash back these kind of deductions. When the company is facing a loss position, so the deduction cannot be really applied, there is the possibility to ask for a refund up to 80% of the deduction previously generated and calculated. But we cannot apply the cashback during the same year than the deduction was generated, but only after 1 year, and provided that the project and the staff are still maintained for at least 2 additional years. Another interesting tax deduction, the patent box regime, which is looking for a reduction of the income coming or arising from some assets, such as patents, advanced registered software, utility models. But as you see, I'm not mentioning trading marks. Trading marks cannot benefit from the patent box regime. And what is the benefit for this kind of asset? Well, there will be a 60% reduction of all the income coming from this asset, both when we are in front of an assignment or a transfer of this kind of asset, okay? And it can be applied regardless of when the asset was created, and can be still applied for an infinity period, okay? There is not a time limit, okay? Of course, there are some limits that we need to check very carefully. For instance, the entity transferring and benefiting from the patent box regime must have been created the asset at least in a 25%, okay? And there are also some requirements regarding the transferee receiving the asset. First of them is that the asset is really used in a business activity, and second, that this entity receiving the asset is not located in a tax haven, okay? Of course, There are many other tax deduction and tax incentives, such as those for entities filming series or films in Spain, or for those hiring disabled staff, or for entities making donations. There is even a specific tax benefit for looking for self-financing, that the Spanish entities are self-financing. So they are reinvesting their profit instead of making a dividends distribution. But unfortunately, we do not have enough time to go further in any of them. I want to finish the explanations about the corporate income tax, mention a specific tax regime, which is very advantageous and interesting for some holding entities located in Spain. This is applicable for Spanish entities, needs to be set up in Spain, which are holding and managing shares in a foreign non-resident entities. Okay, we have a holding entity located and established in Spain, holding and managing shares in other entities, but those entities need to be outside of Spain. In such a case, the main tax benefit is that the Spanish entity can apply a 95% exemption for all the dividends and capital gains coming from those shares in non-resident entities. But this is not everything. When there is a distribution of dividends from the Spanish holdco to the final shareholders, in case they are non-resident individuals or entities, this should be considered as not obtained in Spanish territory and therefore not taxable at all in Spain. So normally there should be a withholding tax over those dividends applied here in Spain. But when this special regime called, because I forgot mentioning, ETBE is applied, those dividends distributed by the Spanish whole company to the non-resident shareholders will not suffer any withholding tax in Spain. And the same when those Spanish shares in the ETBE entity are sold. The capital gains will not be withheld for those investors, for those shareholders not tax resident in Spain. Of course, there are some specific requirements to be checked very carefully if we want to apply this special regime, but we are running very short of time, so we cannot go deeper on that. And finally, and very, very briefly, this is a compliant obligation very linked to the corporate income tax, which is the tax transfer pricing obligation regarding to the documentation. And again, we speak again about threshold, but thresholds not only for the Spanish entity, but considered in a group base, okay? So for those entities belonging to a group, an international or national group, okay? Even if they are not consolidating for accounting purposes, if the turnover of the total group is over 10 million euros, and at the same time, both requirements needs to be met at the same time. At the same time, the Spanish entity is involved in transactions with any other related entity over 200,000 euros, both requirements. Company turnover over 10 million euros, transactions with any other related entity over 250,000 euros, we need to prepare local file. And if the turnover of the company group is not over 10 million, but over 45 million euros, in such a case, additionally to the local file, we also need to prepare a master file. There is not a specific deadline for submitting this documentation to tax offices, but needs to be available after the closing of the deadline for every corporate income tax. And the documentation needs to be updated every year and kept for 4 years, because this is the statute of limitation for the corporate income tax in Spain. That finished my part. And I'm very delighted to pass over to my colleague, Elena, who will speak about interesting issues on VAT. Thank you.
Well, hello, good morning, everyone. For the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about VAT in Spain. So, first, some general points. In Spain, there is no minimum threshold for VAT registration and VAT submissions. Even though the directive should have already been implemented, Spain had not transposed the change yet. The general VAT rate in Spain is 21%, which applies to most goods and services. The reduced rate is 10% for food, transport, tourism, and certain cultural activities. And finally, the super reduced VAT rate is 4% applicable to essential goods such as bread or medicine or something like that. The frequency on the VAT return submission is quarterly, and the deadline is 20 calendar days after the quarter ends. However, there is a special rule where the VAT returns are due monthly. This is when the Spanish revenue exceeds roughly 6 million euros and regardless of turnover entities included in Redeme. The deadline in this case is 30 calendar days after the month ends. Let me now explain some important details to keep in mind. The result of VAT returns can be payable or refundable. When the entity has a payable position, it's important to note that the Spanish tax authorities take into account the date when they receive the money, not the date of the transfer. For refundable positions, there is two different situations depending on the frequency of VAT return submissions. When an entity submits quarterly returns, the refundable VAT can only be requested in the last quarter VAT returns, submitted in January of the following year. However, when an entity submits monthly returns, the refundable VAT can likewise be requested in the last monthly VAT return, submitted in January, or in a monthly basis if the entity is registered in Redeme. Something to note is that the BS registration is not automatic in Spain, but the entity must separately ask for the registration with authorities. Then the authorities confirm the registration at a later stage, but normally open an audit to check that the entity really needs registration to perform intra-community transactions as part of their activity. So now let's focus to some special regimes for VAT. As already mentioned, there is a special mechanism called Redeme, which means that the entity can get the refunds monthly instead of yearly. But this also means that VAT returns must be submitted monthly. Entities who usually reach refundable positions could find it worthwhile to register for Redeme. However, this is also connected with SII, which we will discuss in a few minutes. Redeme cannot be applied directly, but it must be specifically requested, and the request must be done in November of the year prior to when the mechanism takes place, or during the period of filling periodic tax returns, and in this case, the inclusion in Redeme take effect from the day following the end of the settlement period. This means that a company that opts for the Redeme on February 10th will be included in the system starting from March 1st. Okay, there is another mechanism in the Spanish VAT law, which is the deferred import VAT payment mechanism, which allows deferral of the import VAT payment until the date of the VAT submission. This means a financial advantage for the entity since they don't have to make payment to customs. However, they must include the payment through the VAT return submission, but at the same time, these entities deduct the import VAT on the same VAT form. This mechanism cannot be applied directly, but it must be specifically requested as Redeme, and this must be done in November prior to the start of the calendar year in which it is to take effect. It cannot be done in other time. Something closely linked to these regimes is the SII system. The immediate information supply is the electronic management of the BT books. The main objective is to speed up the bad management processes, fight fraud more effectively, and modernize and automate the relationship between companies and the tax administration. The invoice information must be reported to the authorities in different deadlines depending on if they are issued or received invoices. For issued invoices, the deadline is within 4 working days from the issue date. And for receiving invoices, the deadline is within 4 working days from the accounting date. It is important to note that the SII has a specific penalty regime, but the authorities are being tolerant and are not punishing the entities for short delays, at least for now. SII is mandatory when the entities are submitting monthly VAT returns, regardless of the reason. That is, large entities, companies registered in BT groups, or companies registered in REDEME. SII can also affect companies that voluntarily applied for it. However, such companies still submit VAT returns quarterly. The inclusion in this case is not immediate. Companies registered in each period will be included in SII from the beginning of the next period. For instance, if a company opts for the SII on February 10th, will be included in the system starting for April 1st. Moreover, when entities join SII in the middle of the year, and the situation, the invoices from the beginning of the year must be also submitted in SII, even though the entity was not included in SII until at later stage. That being said, the entity has until the end of the year to provide the authorities with this information. However, all the invoices issued or received after April 1st must be submitted within the specific deadlines in the C, as previously mentioned. Finally, just to mention that the voluntary inclusion in SII has a minimum duration of at least 1 year. Okay, one of the advantages of the SII is the simplification and reduction of submission, since these entities don't have to submit the informative forms 347 or 390. In addition, entities in SII have 10 extra days to submit the VAT returns. The SII also helps in the VAT reform, since VAT audits are simpler. And finally, the authorities have developed a tool which provides a pre-filled draft of the VAT form, which help entities to reduce the mistakes in submissions. Okay, for the next few minutes, I want to mention the new regulations about invoicing, which will affect entities and professionals in the near future. The 2 new requirements in Spain are called Verifactur e-invoicing. The first is designed to guarantee the veracity of invoices issued and their automatic submission to the tax authorities, whereas e-invoicing is more about relationship between taxpayers using electronic files rather than physical or PDF documents. Okay, let's take a closer look at it in turn. Verifactur enters into force on the 1st January 2026. This will affect all Spanish entities and professionals, and any other entity with a permanent establishment in Spain, as well as the manufacturers of the software. Non-resident entities without a permanent establishment in Spain will not be affected by Verifacto. Also, entities submitting SII or those not obliged to issue invoices will not be affected either. The system will affect all the issued invoices, B2B, B2C, and B2G, and for national EU or no EU transactions. It will not affect to receive invoices. The main aim of Verifactor is to have a certified software which ensures the authenticity and integrity of invoices and the automatic submission of them to the authorities. However, invoicing does not have an implementation date yet. Once the regulation is published, the companies with a turnover over 8 million euros will have 1 year to implement it, and other entities and professionals will have 2 years. Invoicing will affect all entities and professionals in B2B transaction without exemption by type. The only exclusion is when one of the parties don't have their business headquarters or a permanent establishment in Spain. This means that invoicing will be mandatory for issuance and receipt of invoices in transaction between entities and professionals who both have their place of business or permanent establishment in the Spanish territory. The main aim of invoicing is to modernize, simplify, and make the invoice process safer and more efficient. Okay, now I like briefly mention the possibility of the companies to recover the unpaid VAT from issued invoice. Companies and professionals can recover the uncollectible VAT from the unpaid invoice just under certain requirements. First thing is to take into account the deadline for considering an invoice as unpaid, which is 1 year since the VAT accrual, or when the turnover of the company is less than roughly 6 million euros, voluntarily 6 months or 1 year. The invoice must be correctly registered under the accounting books. Moreover, there isn't a minimum amount required for recovering the VAT of unpaid invoice when it is an entity and freelance. However, the taxable amount of the transaction must be higher than 50 euros in case the recipient is an individual or final customer. The entity must issue a credit note amending or cancelling the output VAT of the unpaid invoice, which must be issued within 6 months from the expiration of the previously mentioned 1 year or 6-month period, depending on the case. Additionally, within 1 month period from the issue date of the credit note, the cancellation of the VAT must be reported to the Spanish tax authorities through a specific tax procedure. Finally, it's important to note that the supplier is under the obligation to start a legal claim or notarial request against the debtor or any other procedure that reliable and convincingly prove that the payment is requested by the supplier to the debtor and allows to prove the forwarding to the content, the identity of the sender and addressee, as well as the result and the date of delivery. An important change here is that in the recent years is the General Directorate of Taxes, following the Supreme Court criteria, has confirmed the use of the Burofax may be accepted to prove the claim for unpaid invoice. Okay, finally, let's close with some comments on the plastic tax. Okay, in Spain, the tax on non-reusable plastic packaging came into force in January 2023 and affect the whole Spanish territory, including Ceuta and Melilla. The tax rate is 45 cents per kilogram of non-reusable recycled plastic. This tax affects non-reusable packaging containing plastic, semi-processed plastic products, and packaging closures, presentation elements such as caps, wrappers, ribbons, but only the non-recyclable portion of the plastic is taxed. There are some exemptions from the tax, which is when the total weight of non-recycled plastic does not exceed 5 kilograms in a month, or when the non-reusable plastics are for medical, specific health, or certain agricultural uses. When the taxable event takes place depends on the kind of transactions. For domestic manufacturing of taxable product, it is the first delivery of the tax product. For import, it must be paid at customs when presenting the dual SAT. And when the transactions are intra-community acquisition, there is a self-assessment similar to VAT. The tax form for declaration and payment is 592 for manufacturers and intra-community customers. The frequency of submission is the same as the VAT frequency. However, when an entity needs to ask for a refund, for example, because the product are exported or they are not used, there is a different form to complete, that is A22. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Now we will follow with Manuel.
Thank you, Elena, and good morning, everyone. In this final part of the webinar, we will explain the tax framework applicable to individuals coming to Spain and the different special regimes available to them for a more efficient taxation. First of all, let's talk about tax residency in Spain, because according to a Spanish tax law, tax residency is determined on a calendar year basis, meaning you're considered a resident for the entire year. So the tax year cannot be split up. Basically, there are two main criteria to determine whether someone is a Spanish tax resident. The first one is the physical presence test, by which you are deemed resident if you spend more than 183 days in Spain during a calendar year. To determine this, any occasional absence will be also considered, unless they can prove tax residence in another country. The second criteria is the center of economic interest, by which even if you don't meet the presence test, you can still be considered a resident if your main center of economic interest, like your main source of income or investments, is in Spain. And lastly, an individual would be presumed to be tax resident in Spain if her spouse and minor children are considered tax residents according to the mentioned criteria, unless they can prove tax residence in another non-tax haven country using a tax residence certificate issued by the other country. So this is just a mere presumption, a mere legal presumption that can be revoked through the tax residence certificate. Bear in mind that in the event of a resident conflict, for example, if another country also considers you as a tax resident, Spain will apply the relevant double taxation agreement in force to resolve the situation. In this case, the criteria which are indicated in the slides would be applied one in the absence of the previous to solve the conflict of residence in favor of one of the two countries. And once the tax residency in Spain has been determined, there is also an important factor to be considered, as tax rates will also depend on which region of Spain you live in. This is very important for personal income tax, as half of the income tax rate is regulated by autonomous region, and in addition, liability for wealth tax and inheritance and gift tax is also calculated according to the law of the autonomous region. But how is your autonomous region determined? Well, first is the region where you spend the most days during the year. Second, if that's not clear, the region where your main economic interests are located. So as you can see, this is very similar to the previous requirements for being considered as tax resident in Spain. And finally, there's also a presumption for the region where your last declared residence was for tax purposes. Now, let's take a closer at the taxation under the general regime for individuals. First of all, as a tax resident, your worldwide income is subject to Spanish personal income tax, regardless of where it's generated. Spanish personal income tax splits income into two categories. The first one is general income. This includes employment income, income from professional activities, income from real estate, or capital gains which don't come from the sale of assets. The marginal rates are progressive, and the marginal rates applicable depend on the autonomous regions. For example, the tax rates go from 19%, which is the starting rate in most regions, but can reach, for example, 45 in Madrid or 54 in Catalonia. The second category of income is savings income. This is made up of investments income like dividends or interest and capital gains from the sale of assets. The tax rates go from 19% to 30% in 2025, regardless of the autonomous region of residence. So it's the same for the entire national territory. Under the general regime, there's also a nil rate band of 5,550 euros per person, which can be increased depending on the personal circumstances of the taxpayer. Having said that, there are several exemptions. And one of the most important is the exemption on income from work carried out abroad, which is commonly known as 7P exemption, because this is the article in the law which regulates the tax benefit. According to this exemption, if you work abroad for a non-resident entity, you may be eligible for an exemption of up to 60,100 euros per year. Now we move on to wealth tax and the recent solidarity tax on large fortunes. As an introduction, individuals who are tax residents in Spain are subject to wealth tax on all their assets and rights, regardless of where these assets are located. This tax is payable on the total net value of the taxable assets at the end of the year. In accordance with the national law, taxpayers must file a return if their tax calculation results in a payable amount, or when the value of their assets or rights is greater than 2 million euros. The tax rates in wealth tax are also progressive and go from more or less 0.2% to 3.5%, but they vary depending on the autonomous region, because the autonomous region can vary the rates and personal allowances. For example, a few years ago, some regions like Madrid and Andalusia, among others, created a 100% tax relief. So there were important differences between regions for the purposes of this tax, because residents in some regions didn't pay the tax at all. However, in 2022, the new solidarity tax on large fortunes came into force, which applies to net assets over 3.7 million euros and was introduced by the central government to eliminate regional difference in the wealth taxation. So what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice, nowadays, wealth tax is payable in the entire Spanish territory, which means that the nil rate band in regions like Madrid or Andalusia is effectively 3.7 million euros, whereas the nil rate band in other regions like Catalonia is 500,000 euros, or in other regions could be 700,000 euros, and so on. So as you can see, these are important factors when advising on global mobility for clients. And well, on the positive side, to prevent excessive taxation, there's a combined limit. Your total wealth tax and personal income tax liability cannot exceed 60% of your total taxable income for the year. And there are also several exemptions, like the value of your main residence up to 300,000 euros, or the value of the shareholding in companies that carry out an economic activity. But well, these exemptions have difficult requirements to comply with, so must be analyzed on a case-by-case basis for each taxpayer. Let's now turn to the special regimes, both of which are named after footballers. The first one is the special regime for workers posted to Spanish territory, commonly known as the Beckham Law, which is a special tax regime for individuals moving to Spain for work reasons. Under this regime, you are taxed as a non-resident for up to 6 years. The year you move, plus 5 more. But you must have not been tax resident in Spain in the previous 5 years before you move. And you must move to Spain for a specific work reason, which are these work reasons are regulated in the law, like employment in Spain, including remote work, becoming a director of a Spanish company, having a favorable report from the Spanish institution ENISA for innovative activities, or engaging in a high-level professional activities for startups or R&D. An important limit for the Beckham Law is that you cannot use this regime if you earn income qualified as obtained through a permanent establishment, like, for example, self-employed income. So you can't carry out a professional activity under this regime, and you cannot have a relevant shareholding in an entity which pays your salary and which carries out a professional activity. So this is an important limit a lot of times for individuals moving to Spain. And what does this mean imply for the taxpayers? Well, opting into this regime means that personal income tax is calculated only on income obtained within the Spanish territory, as per the rules established in the non-residence income tax law, with certain specialities, like, for example, general income, which are employment income, income from real estate, etc., is taxed at a flat tax rate of 24% for the first 600,000 euros. The excess over this amount is taxed at 47%. And to give a general idea, it's generally better to choose to be taxed under the special tax regime in Spain if the employment income received is higher than 60,000 euros per year. And it's important to note that under this regime, all employment income is considered to have been obtained in the Spanish territory, meaning that worldwide income is taxable in Spain at the flat tax rate of 24%, up to the 600,000 euros. But for example, in the case of savings income, like dividends, interest, and so on, from savings income from Spanish sources, is taxed at a progressive scale from 19% to 30%. So only dividends, for example, in the case of dividends, only dividends from Spanish entities will be taxable under this regime. Therefore, those dividends from entities, from foreign entities, will not be taxed in Spain. Or regarding the income from real estate located abroad is not taxed in Spain, since only income from Spanish properties is taxable. And regarding wealth tax, there's an important advantage as well, because the general rule is that to Spanish tax residents under the general regime, wealth tax applies to their worldwide assets, as I said before. But for taxpayers covered by this special regime, wealth tax affects only their Spanish income. There are other tax benefits, like, for example, the no obligation to file the annual informative declaration on assets and rights held abroad, the commonly known as tax form 720. But there's also some potential disadvantages to consider. By opting for this special regime, they would not be able to take advantage of the benefits of most double taxation treaties to restrict taxation as non-resident in other countries. And nor do they have the right to deduct expenses or personal allowances in their personal income tax calculation. Another interesting tax relief is a new tax benefit in the Community of Madrid for new taxpayers coming from abroad, which is commonly known as the Mbappe Law. This tax relief is effective from January 1st, 2024, and it offers a 20% tax relief for investments in qualifying assets like bonds, securities, shares, but if certain requirements are met. The first requirement is you should become tax resident of Madrid. The second is that you haven't been a Spanish tax resident in the past 5 years. Third, you should maintain your residence in Madrid for 6 years. And finally, the investments should be made in the year you become tax resident or the following year, but must be held for 6 years. If the investment is sold before the end of the 6 years, you can reinvest within 1 month to keep the deduction. This tax relief, it's important to note that this tax relief only applies to the regional portion of the personal income tax liability, which is about half of the total tax liability, of the half of the total personal income tax liability under the general regime. The deduction is applied in the tax year in which the investment is made and in the following 5 years in the event of insufficient tax liability. So what does this mean in practice? This means that a person who makes a significant investment during their first year of residence in Madrid can avoid paying half of the personal income tax liability during 6 years because of this relief. And finally, let's do a quick overview of taxation for non-residents. As a non-resident, only your Spanish source of income is taxed under the non-resident income tax. The general tax rate is 19% for residents in the European Union and 24% for residents of other countries. But there are several specialities for certain kind of income. For example, dividends are always taxed at 19%, or the pensions are taxed according to a progressive scale. For real estate that isn't rented out, there's a notional taxable income and a tax should be paid each year on this notional taxable income in the same way than in the case of residents under the general regime of personal income tax. And to wrap up, just mention that non-residents are also subject to wealth tax and inheritance and gift tax, but only for assets and rights located in Spain. The applicable rates and deductions depend on the autonomous region where the highest value assets are located. But in any case, the taxation for non-residents also depends on the applicable double taxation treaty. So we must analyze the case for each client on a case-by-case basis. And okay, that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much. And I think, Marian, that now we are ready to take questions.
Thank you, Elena and Manuel. Perfect timing. So we still have a couple of minutes to address the question that we have received. So we have some of them. I will start with those regarding the corporate income tax. So if a multinational group with presence in Spain wants to open a new entity, since the startup law will not apply, it will have the benefit of other reduced tax rate. You understand very well. As forming part of a multinational group, it's not possible to apply the the new created or startup tax reduced. However, you may apply for the other tax reduced tax rate, provided that the threshold, the turnover of all the international group do not exceed the limits we were speaking at the beginning of the webinar, okay? So we need to consider if the whole group is under 10 million euros turnover. In such a case, yes, the new Spanish entity may apply a reduced tax rate. Following question, we have an association registered in Spain. It was established in 2023. Foreign declared profits will be fall under the microenterprise rate. Well, for associations, there are specific and more reduced tax rates. but only when the kind of association meets a lot of different legal requirements. Otherwise, if it does not fall under the special tax rate for association, the entity will follow the standard rules, and we should consider the total turnover of the company group to check what is the rate applicable here in Spain. Will it be possible to send the slide? Yes, we will manage it later. And is the corporate income tax rate 25% for a Spanish company with an accounting period from 1st January to 31st December 25? Yes, the reduced rates came into force from 2025 and the following years, okay? And of course, we need to consider the limits and threshold we were mentioning. Disregards when is the closing of the financial year, okay? But of course, we need to consider the turnover for the full tax period. And I believe we also have a question regarding to plastic tax for you, Elena.
Okay, guys, in Spanish. Yeah, Canary, it's within the its subject, but not when the plastic is coming from the Spanish territory. It is in the it is the same like Ceuta y Melilla, but coming from another country different from Spain. Okay, I think that's all, Mariam.
Yeah, that's all. We do not have any other questions right now. But here you can find our contact details. We know we are part of the international tax team at Baker Tilly, Spain. So please feel free to contact us if you have any other question or if you are interested in checking other possibilities about the Spanish tax system. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.